The sun rose slow over Santa Fe, turning the adobe walls into soft gold. From her upstairs window, Eleanor Whitmore could see the dusty street stretching out toward the hills. The smell of baking bread from the plaza, mixing with the faint tang of horse sweat and dry mesquite. In the front of her father's grand home, a dressmaker's mannequin stood framed in the parlor window, draped in the pale silk of a gown meant for a governor's son's bride. They had told her she was lucky. The match had been arranged in hushed conversations over brandy, her father shaking hands with men in dark suits, while her mother clutched at her arm and spoke of duty. The governor's son, Thomas Avery, was the kind of man who smiled without showing his teeth. He had kissed her hand once, politely, as though sealing a treaty. Eleanor had not yet decided if she feared him. That morning, she took her coffee on the balcony, watching the plaza below come alive, traders unloading bolts of cloth, soldiers passing in pairs, an old Navajo woman arranging clay pots on a blanket. The air felt heavier than usual. A rider appeared at the far edge of town, his figure blurred by the rising heat. He moved slow, his horse a dark shadow against the pale earth. The townsfolk turned to look as he approached, his presence drawing silence like a storm cloud. His hair was long and black, bound with a strip of leather. His shirt was the faded buckskin of a man who lived far from town, stitched with beads whose colors had dulled from sun and dust. Across his back hung a bow in a leather sling, and his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, swept the street without lingering. Someone whispered, "Apache." He did not stop at the plaza. He rode past the governor's mansion, past the church, past Eleanor's home. But as he passed her balcony, he looked up. It was no more than a glance, but it held her still. Not in fear, though fear was there, but in something sharper, stranger, that she could not name. The horse moved on, hooves drumming slow against the hard ground until the sound faded. Her coffee had gone cold by the time she set it down. By evening, the town was talking. An Apache in Santa Fe was not common, not without purpose. Some said he was a scout for a band in the hills. Others claimed he carried a message for the governor. No one knew his name. Eleanor lay awake long after the lamps were out, the air in her room thick and warm. She could hear the faint rustle of cottonwoods by the river, the call of a lone night bird. And beneath those sounds, she felt the weight of that single glance, as if it had been left in the room with her, silent and watching. In the morning, the wedding dress was still in the parlor window, untouched. But to Eleanor, it no longer looked like silk. It looked like a shroud. 2 days passed before Eleanor saw him again. By then, the plaza had been swept clean of Saturday dust, and the gossip of the stranger had woven itself through every porch and doorway. Some swore he had been sent to bargain for prisoners taken in a raid. Others muttered of stolen horses, of blood debts owed since before most in town had been born. Eleanor listened from the shadows of her father's veranda as the women traded, tales over baskets of laundry. "Mark my words," one said. "A man like that comes with trouble trailing behind him like smoke." Another crossed herself, but when she saw him again, there was no smoke, only the sound of hoofbeats soft on the packed dirt as he led his horse to the blacksmith's. He carried himself with the quiet of someone who belonged to the land, more than to the town, as if every step were measured against something only he could see. Their eyes met again, not by chance this time. He paused, one hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle, and nodded to her. It was not the nod of an introduction. It was the nod of recognition. She felt heat rise in her face. She told herself it was the sun. That night at supper, her father mentioned the man. "They say his name's Chaco," he said, carving into the roast. "One of Mongas's people, though I thought all his band were gone or scattered. Came alone, they say. Keeps to himself." Her mother frowned. "Why is he here?" Her father shrugged. "Don't matter. He's not here for us." But Eleanor knew they were wrong. Chaco's gaze had settled on her twice now, in a town where he owed no allegiance and sought no welcome. The thought was not entirely frightening, and that unsettled her more than fear would have. The third meeting was not in the plaza, but at the old stone well near the edge of town. Eleanor had gone to fetch water herself, something she was rarely permitted to do. Under the pretext of helping the kitchen, Chaco was already there, filling a water skin. He looked up when she approached, the shadow of his hat hiding most of his expression. "You shouldn't carry the bucket yourself," he said in a voice low and even, the accent curling around the English like wind over rock. Eleanor tightened her grip on the rope. "And why not?" "Because someone will think you don't belong to the house you walk from." It was not an insult, though it could have been. It was a warning. She realized then that he saw more than most, and it made her uneasy in a way she could not name. They worked in silence, drawing water. The creak of the rope and the splash below filled the space between them. When the bucket was full, he lifted it without effort and set it at her feet. "You are to marry the governor's son," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. "Then you are not free." She wanted to tell him he was wrong. Instead, she said nothing. And when she walked back to the house, her hands were wet and cold from the well rope, though the sun was warm. The governor's mansion sat high on the hill, its whitewashed walls catching the last of the evening sun. Lanterns were lit early that night, their light spilling across the steps as carriages arrived. Eleanor, in the pale silk gown that had been fitted to her shoulders without her consent, moved like a figure painted into a picture, graceful, silent, present in body but not in thought. She had been told this dinner was in her honor. The governor's son, Thomas Avery, was there, standing with a glass of brandy, smiling as though the whole affair were a performance for his amusement. His hair was slicked back, his boots polished, his words smooth and without weight. Eleanor played her part, a polite nod, a soft reply, a practiced smile. Yet her mind strayed to the plaza, to the edge of town, to the well where a man with dark eyes had said she was not free. The words had stayed with her, clinging to her thoughts like burrs. Midway through the evening, her father drew her toward the open balcony, the cool night air washing over her face. From there, she could see the faint flicker of lights from the far side of town. A shape moved at the edge of the lantern glow below, a rider passing slowly, watching the mansion from the shadow of the road. Her heart quickened. She knew that silhouette. "You'll have to start thinking like a wife," her father said beside her. Unaware of the glance she had just stolen toward the dark road. "This marriage will bind our families. It will keep the peace." Eleanor nodded, but her eyes remained on the fading outline of the rider, until it vanished into the night. She wondered if he had seen her. She wondered why that thought mattered more than any words spoken to her in the room behind her. 3 days later, the market was alive with voices, traders calling out their goods, children weaving through the crowd, the air thick with the smell of roasting chiles and fresh bread. Eleanor moved between stalls with her mother, trailing her fingers along bolts of cloth, pretending to listen to the measured talk of fabric weights and dye lots. Then, in a gap between stalls, she saw him again. Chaco stood at the far edge of the square, speaking to a man she recognized as the blacksmith's cousin. His face was calm, but his hand rested on a knife at his belt, not in threat, but as if habit had taught him to keep it near. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. She could not have said what it was, a warning, perhaps, or a promise. Moments later, the blacksmith's cousin turned sharply, his expression shifting into something colder. Words passed too quietly for her to hear, but the cousin's hand went to his own knife. It was over as quickly as it began. Chaco stepped back, said something low and firm, and the cousin's hand fell away. The two men parted without another word. Eleanor's mother tugged at her sleeve, pulling her back toward the stalls. "Don't stare," she said under her breath. But Eleanor had seen enough to know that the stranger carried trouble with him, and that he was not afraid to stand in its shadow. That night, she dreamed of knives glinting in the sun, and of eyes that saw more than they should. Late summer storms had darkened the sky, and the air smelled of rain and dust. Eleanor walked the narrow path along the river, the hem of her dress catching in the grass. She had slipped away from the house, needing the quiet hum of water and wind to still her thoughts. The river ran low, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Somewhere upstream, a branch cracked. She turned, and there he was. Chaco stepped from the shadows as if he had always been there. The bough still slung across his back, the rain beginning to bead in his hair. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "And yet I am." He studied her for a long moment. "The governor's son is not the man they say he is." She felt her breath catch. "And what man is that?" "The kind who takes what he wants because he thinks it's owed to him." The river whispered at their feet. She wanted to ask how he knew. She wanted to tell him she did not need saving. But the truth was, she didn't know what she needed. When the rain began to fall harder, he stepped aside, leaving the path open for her to pass. She did not move. They stood like that until the storm broke fully. The sky split with lightning, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. When she finally walked past him, neither spoke again. But in the days that followed, she found herself listening for the sound of the river, wondering if he still waited in the shadows. The storm had passed, leaving the streets of Santa Fe washed clean. The dust pressed down into darkened earth. That morning, Eleanor found a folded scrap of paper slipped beneath the edge of her balcony door. There was no seal, no signature, only her name written in a hand she did not know. She hesitated before opening it. Voices from downstairs floated upward, her father speaking with someone in clipped, cautious tones. She turned the paper over in her hand, wondering who had the nerve to place it there. When she finally unfolded it, she found only 6 words. "They are not what they seem." There was no further explanation, no name. Her thoughts went immediately to Chaco. But why write instead of speak? And if the warning was about Thomas Avery? As she suspected, what did he know that others did not? At supper, she found herself watching Thomas with new eyes. He laughed at some joke a councilman told, but there was a sharpness to his gaze when he thought no one was looking. She noticed the way he set his glass down, with a little too much force when she failed to answer his question right away. That night, she placed the letter under her pillow, as though the nearness of it might help her understand. But all it did was fill her dreams with shadows in the corners of candlelit rooms, faces half hidden, and a rider watching from the dark edge of the street. By morning, she had resolved not to speak of the letter to anyone. Market day returned, and with it, the hum of life in the plaza. Eleanor went with her mother as usual, keeping her gaze on the baskets of peppers and the jars of honey. Yet she could not help glancing toward the blacksmith's shop, where she had seen Chaco before. The air shifted. She heard the commotion before she saw it. A shout, the crash of a barrel, a man stumbling backward with a gash across his cheek. Chaco stood a few paces away, his knife in hand. His eyes locked on 2 men who now kept their distance. Blood dripped onto the dust, each drop vanishing into the earth. The crowd murmured, some edging closer, others backing away. Eleanor's mother pulled at her arm, but she stood rooted, unable to look away. One of the men spat on the ground and muttered something about savages. Chaco didn't answer. He simply sheathed his knife, turned his back, and walked toward the edge of the plaza. The crowd parted for him without a word. Only when he disappeared into the side streets did Eleanor realize her hands were trembling. She told herself it was fear, but deep down, she knew it was something far more dangerous, curiosity. That night, she wondered what had started the fight, and why Chaco had not struck to kill when he clearly could have. A week passed before she saw him again. This time, it was not in town, but in the hills beyond the river. Eleanor had ridden out alone under the pretense of gathering wildflowers, her bonnet casting shadows across her face. The chapel stood weathered and empty, its adobe walls cracked, its door hanging on one hinge. She had been there once as a child, but now it felt like a place forgotten by all but the wind. Chaco was inside. He stood before the altar, not in prayer, but in thought, his hands resting lightly on the worn wood. He looked up when she stepped in, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said again. But this time his tone was different, not warning, but almost weary. She moved closer, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of rain from the open door. "Why are you here?" He hesitated, then spoke quietly. I came to see the place where a man died for a promise he could not keep." She waited, but he said no more. His eyes lingered on the altar, then on her. "The governor's son knows nothing of keeping promises," he added, "and you will learn that soon enough." Eleanor felt the weight of the chapel press in around her, the walls holding secrets that neither of them spoke aloud. When she left, the wind followed her down the hill, whispering in a language she could not understand. The day before her wedding, the air in Santa Fe felt close, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. The town was dressed in anticipation, fresh garlands at the church doors, bright cloth hung from balconies. The plaza swept clean of the week's dust. Eleanor moved through the house like a shadow. The seamstress had come early to check the gown, to smooth the silk, to make sure the veil fell just so. Her mother fussed over every detail, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. By late afternoon, Eleanor escaped to the balcony. The street below was quiet, the light shifting toward gold. She thought of the chapel in the hills, of the words Chaco had spoken there. Then she saw him, standing at the far end of the street, beside his horse. He did not move toward her, nor raise a hand. But the sight of him in that moment was like the first gust. Before a storm, inevitable, stirring the dust in her chest. As the shadows lengthened, she went to her room and found another letter, folded and left upon her bed. "If you stay, you will not survive what follows." There was no signature. She hid it under her pillow before her mother came in to wish her good night. Sleep did not come. She lay awake listening to the slow beat of her own heart, wondering which was worse, the life she was promised, or the unknown that might come if she walked away. The morning broke, clear and bright. The church bells rang early, summoning the town. Eleanor walked up the aisle on her father's arm, the silk of her dress whispering against the stone floor. Thomas Avery waited at the altar, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her skin tighten beneath the weight of his gaze. The air inside the church was warm, heavy with the scent of candles and flowers. The priest began to speak. She barely heard the words, only the low hum of her own pulse and the memory of Chaco's voice telling her she was not free. Then, from the doorway, a shadow fell across the aisle. A figure stepped inside, silent, unhurried. "Chaco." The murmurs began at once. Men shifted in the pews, hands moving toward belts. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I will not allow this to happen," Chaco said, his voice carrying without strain. "Not when I know the truth." Eleanor's father rose, his face pale with anger. "You have no place here." Chaco ignored him. His eyes were on Eleanor. "You know what I mean." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. And then Thomas stepped forward, his smile thin as a blade. "Get out," he said softly. Chaco did not move. In the stillness, Eleanor found herself breathing again, not with fear, but with the sudden clarity that this moment was hers to decide. The church never finished the vows. Voices rose, chairs scraped, and by the time the sheriff pushed through the crowd, Eleanor was gone. She did not run blindly. She knew the path to the river, and from there to the low hills beyond. The hem of her gown caught on thorns, the veil torn free by the wind. She left both where they fell. At the crest of the hill, Chaco waited with his horse. He offered her his hand without a word. She took it. They rode in silence for hours, the town falling away behind them, the land opening wide and empty. The sun dipped low, painting the earth in fire and shadow. When they finally stopped, it was near a narrow canyon where the wind moved like a living thing. Chaco tended the horse while Eleanor stood at the edge, looking out across the vast sweep of desert. "You could still go back," he said at last. She shook her head. "And be what they chose for me." "No." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then we go forward." The wind carried their words away, scattering them into the endless sky. Somewhere in the distance, Santa Fe would already be telling the story. The governor's son left at the altar, the bride who vanished with the Apache. But here, on the far side of the hills, there was only the road ahead and the slow, steady beat of hooves on dry earth. And in the years that followed, When the tale was told in low voices by firelight, they said she had never looked back,